So, good evening and hello everybody. And this is also the test. Can you hear me well also at the back? Good. So I may welcome you most warmly to my talk, which Haley said it already, which will be about my time as an artist in residence at the Ness of Brodgar last year. And I will be sharing with you some of my views and interpretations I arrived at through my artistic involvement with these structures there. You will excuse me for me reading the best part of my talk. I'm not doing it free-handedly. English isn't my first language, so it's easier for me to do it that way. Working Away is the title I have chosen for today's talk. And I use it in the sense of pursuing an activity diligently and persistently. This seems an apt expression for many reasons. A lot of the painstakingly executed excavation work consists of patiently removing and revealing layer upon layer of earth and other materials that have accumulated over the years, and to unearth the hidden structures. This also includes recovering and registering finds and gathering samples for further investigation, as well as documenting and recording every single step in writing, drawing, photography, producing 3D images, and so on. Observing all this last year, during my time at the Ness as an artist, my respect for this fastidious work grew day by day. I watched the archaeologists washing and inspecting every single stone when dismantling a wall in Structure 1 and extending existing trenches for a better understanding of what has already been excavated, or to ascertain a hunch, going deeper and deeper to reach older levels. All this in pursuit of a coherent picture of the sequence of how these structures came into existence in the past. Looking back on my own activities, I can say that I was working away in quite a similar way, but with the means of an artist. I used drawing, and here you have a selection of drawings that came about last year. I used drawing as a tool to understand the structures. And in this pursuit, I concentrated on selected structures and situations, sitting and observing, sitting and drawing those situations again and again. Seeing the marks on the stones, I was driven to make marks myself, on stone, on paper, and later also on porcelain. This is a detail of the south entrance of Structure 1 and the second stone from the top. You can see some incision marks. So I made marks on paper, rapidly and casually as here, slowly and conscientiously. All this in order to trace and empathize with associated states of mind. I ended up with piles of drawings. Back home, they became the basis for my further work. This included experiments of mark making on sheets of porcelain, a material in character somewhere between paper and stone. Now, A few words without any pictures. From what I could gather, the builders of the structures at the Ness had worked away too. They built and rebuilt. They dismantled older structures to erect new buildings on top. When walls became unstable, they were reinforced. When they toppled down, they were re-erected, as can be seen, for example, in structure 12. And the layout of a building could be changed completely by a newly built wall, as is the case with structure 1. New entrances were established and previous ones got blocked. It seems that building and rebuilding was a never-ending activity, deeply ingrained in the life of Neolithic people. The processual character of building, which has also been investigated by Antonia Thomas, can also be seen in the practice across Europe of reusing the stones of older structures, and one that can be observed in Brittany and Ireland as well. Here at the Ness, the reused stones were either inset in a wall or inserted at the base of a new wall or blocked entrance. I am convinced that the many incision marks on the stones, which very often appear randomly set, can generally be accounted for by the Neolithic people's handling of stone, which was so much part of their life, which was so much part of their life. I'll come back to that later. Here, the photograph that's also been used for the poster shows structure 12 in the background and in the foreground one of my drawings. Looking back on my time at the Ness now, I cannot help but think that something of the spirit of the time had imparted itself on us, the archaeologists, and all the volunteers working at the Ness, as well as myself and all the other artists engaging with the site. Having explained the reasoning behind the chosen title, I want to tell you a little bit about myself before sharing with you some of the processes I went through whilst working at the Ness, and later when I was working with the material accumulated during my time as an artist there. To clarify, I use the term material here in its literal and figurative sense, ranging from tangible materials such as stone and pigmented clay, the drawings themselves, and the intuitions as reflected in my drawings, through to speculations and suppositions. Of course, I also want to share with you some of the conclusions I arrived at with the aid of all this material. But now, first to myself. I am an artist and long-term educator in the field of applied arts, now retired. I taught for several decades, first in England and then later as a professor at the Düsseldorf University of Applied Sciences. My interest in the Neolithic goes back to the early 1990s, when Marianne Pollich and myself started to visit Neolithic sites across Europe, Western Europe, specifically Eastern Germany, Ireland and Brittany, as well as in England and Scotland, and especially Orkney. Often we asked for and were granted special permission and special access to major sites, such as Newgrange and Cairn T at Loughcrew in Ireland, Gavrinis in Brittany, and also Maes Howe. This gave us the opportunity to study these monuments in depth, bringing to bear our respective approaches. Drawing and painting has become my way of approaching the architectural remains from this time, complementing Marianne's phenomenological and experiential approach. Actually, Neolithic Orkney has held us captive ever since 2005, when we returned after a very first visit in the early 1990s. Thanks to the many special permits granted by Historic Scotland, today it's Historic Environment Scotland, Marianne and myself were able to spend repeated long periods in the inner chamber of Maes Howe. I used to draw there too, using it to explore the specific interplay of light and darkness. That's wrong. Here. This is an exhibition view held at the Tormiston Mill in 2009. So these studies I just described resulted in a presentation of my drawings in the Visitor Centre Tormiston Mill and a performance of a composition for 4 voices inspired by and based on Marianne's experiences and vocal responses during our stays inside of Maes Howe. And I would love to hear it performed, the end composition, to hear it performed at the St. Magnus Festival. Wonder if this will happen one day. Okay, this just aside. And then last year, coinciding with the presentation of Marianne's book, What the Architecture Tells Us, I had another exhibition at the Orcadian Bookshop Gallery where I showed the drawings that were included in Marianne's book. What does this? Yeah, this springs back when it shouldn't. Okay. Needless to say, the excavation activities at the Ness of Brodgar had not escaped our attention. And over the years, we followed its progress with interest, though from the outside. With my retirement in the offing, and with it the prospect of a more flexible time management, I approached Nick Card with a proposal for a residency at the Ness during dig time in 2017. Luckily, he was open to this, and I thus prepared myself for 8 weeks of drawing and sketching at the Ness. This is a familiar sight to many of you, the Ness undercover. Having arrived on day 1 of the dig time in 2017, I witnessed how the site was brought back to life. I saw the tiles and tarpaulins being removed and the structures gradually revealed. The hustle and bustle of the first days was then followed by rather quieter activities, during which the structures were carefully and lovingly cleaned. Now here an overview of Trench P. Wandering around the area, I was struck by how different it was to be on a working site, such as the Ness. Unlike the architectural structures of Maes Howe or Colwyn, for example, which were preserved in a state as they might have been at the time of their erection, the architectural structures at the Ness show the state they were in when decommissioned. They are thus flooded by light and due to the ongoing archaeological activities in constant change. Moving around on this hugely complex site, I felt somewhat daunted by what appeared at first to be an unstructured assortment of stones. Would I ever be able to do what I came to do? I certainly would need a lot of time to develop an understanding, using drawing as a tool to make sense of what I saw. This, at least, did not differ from other sites I have concerned myself with, and, for example, Mesau, Ness, the stones of Ness, and the ring of Brodgar, to name but a few of the sites here in Orkney. Putting these musings aside, I used the first 2 days wandering the site to see which of the structures would speak to me. Maybe not surprisingly, these were structures 1 and structure 12. For both structures had a clearly discernible layout. For my eye, these stood out from the otherwise, as I already said, unstructured expanse of stones. So, when looking at structure 1, that's a detail, the opposition of the angularity of the well-preserved interior in the southern part on the one hand, and the gently curving wall opposite attracted my attention. Structure 12, with its prominent features of the protruding piers and the sagging walls between, appealed to me as well. Later I learned that the features described that first grabbed my attention were due to the ongoing building activities at the Ness in the Neolithic. And here, one of my drawings of structure 12. One of my very first drawings I did of structure 1. And so it was these 2 structures that I engaged with most intensively during my stay. In the course of time, several themes emerged. The first theme, as I just outlined, was the angular and the round. This also appears to be an opposition of the inside to the outside appearance of monuments in general, with Mesau as a most distinctive example. And here we have the external wall of structure 1, and this opposition can be seen at the Ness as well. The precise internal walls, built in straight lines with angular features like the protruding piers and corner buttresses, stand in opposition to the external walling, where the narrow ends are mostly round and the longitudinal walls curve out slightly. Since the structures are not preserved in full height, their complete exterior can only be surmised. The roof tiles found in structure 8 give an indication. And in one of my drawings, I felt compelled to hint at a roofage that echoes gently the roundness of the outer walling. The second theme of movement had manifested itself right at the beginning of my time at the Ness, though I recognized it only much later. My eyes were clearly focused on the better preserved parts of the structures, so I was quite unaware of the subtext in my drawings. And here is a drawing which, to my mind, actually shows this movement quite clearly. Back home, when I looked again at the early drawings, I really was struck by their expression of restless movement, as if the incessant building activities of Neolithic people had been brought to life in my drawing. Yet another theme that emerged quite early was that of restriction and expansion. I had used these terms as the titles for drawings that I had made in response to what I had experienced during one of the long stays inside of Meshau. I did not remember it then when I drew this, but it returned to my mind whilst putting this talk together. The earlier drawings inspired by Meshau related to bodily experiences and sensations that were induced by the stark architectural features of Meshau. At the Ness, I found these opposites in the architectural layout. For example, in the way the structures were positioned so close to one another that only a narrow passage remained between them, or how, moving through the constricted space, the view then expanded to reveal a wider passage and open space, as in this photograph where you see structure 1 on the left and the passage between structure 1, structure 11, and the today called central midden area, the large paved area in front. And here, one of the drawings I did to the theme of restriction and to expansion. So it's the same situation I just showed you in the photograph, looking towards the passage way between 1 and 11, and coming out of this, looking towards the large paved area with the standing stone in line of sight. Here is a detail of structure 1 and its southern entrance. And at structure 1, I found that the entrance situation itself is an embodiment of the concept of restriction and expansion, and can be physically experienced there. The narrow entrance is as it would have been, acts like a passage, the depth of which is determined by the internal and the external walls. Approaching the structure from the wide forecourt, one would have had to pass through the gradually narrowing side walls in a slightly crouched position and surmount a sill stone before reaching the space inside that would have then unfolded before one's eyes. Coming from the inside, it would have been quite similar, though I guess more spectacular, for the southerly entrance of structure 1 opens out to the paved space of what today is the central midden area. And I tried very hard to capture this in one picture. Here is one of my many attempts. I did not succeed. Today, I believe that I had tried to do something that was destined to fail. It is not possible to capture in one image opposing directions of movement, each with its distinct and diverging experiences. Variant messages, such as these, can only be expressed in juxtaposition or in succession. In 2016, Antonia Thomas' book Art and Architecture in Neolithic Orkney came out. This publication contains the most comprehensive documentation of all the incised and picked markings found in Neolithic Orkney. A seminal work indeed. It also kindled my interest, particularly in view of the fact that in the past I had conducted extensive research on the signs and symbols that are so characteristic for the passage graves of Neolithic Ireland and Brittany. The engravings there differ greatly from most of the markings found in mainland Orkney, both in style and in overwhelming presence, as for example at Governess and Newgrange, to name but two. And I want to show you examples. So this is an author stud in Governess, covered from top to bottom with very distinctly engraved symbols here, arches intersecting, set into each other, arching arches, and another one also of Governess. And here from Newgrange, two author studs. I show them next to each other on side. They are actually opposite each other in a very narrow part of the passage. And it's very, very vivid standing between these stones and having them encroaching upon you. Allow me a few words about the term art, which, for want of a better word, is often used to describe these markings, however pronounced they are and whatever technique had been used to make them, chiseled, pecked, or incised. The term art implies intentionality, to say the least. And although there is no one universal definition of art, in lexical definitions there is a general consensus that art is the conscious creation of something beautiful or meaningful, using skill and imagination. No doubt, this definition applies to the author studs I just showed you, and also to quite a number of the decorated stones found across Orkney and at the Ness. But can every mark made by Neolithic people, or any mark that does not seem to serve a practical purpose, be conceived of as art? A question that deserves consideration, and one that has preoccupied me for quite some time now. If not, how else could these marks be explained? And what about the beautiful objects and stones that we, myself included, would not hesitate to consider as art? Yet, the concept of art as we know it today has evolved since the Renaissance, and does not take into account that, before then, art never existed for its own sake. I think it holds true that in Neolithic times there was no such thing as art for art's sake. What is called art today was then part and parcel of all activities. Moreover, it can be assumed that all these activities were intimately linked with ritual, and that beautifully made or decorated objects derived their meaning from this holistic attitude to life. After this digression, I will now return to to the markings that can be found on the dry masonry walls, both inside and outside of the structures, but also on isolated stones that were part of the infill of the structures or were found in significant spatial constellations or in conjunction with other archaeological finds. I will mainly refer to structure 1 and structure 12 and come back to the south entrance of structure 1. The entrance situation there, which I had examined very closely. According to Antonia Thomas, the structure 1 has the highest concentration of decorated or dressed stones on the side. The majority of these are very lightly incised and are barely visible. Yet, at specific times of the day, when the sun illuminates them at a particular angle, you may see intersecting lines or haphazardly or rhythmically set lines. So I'm talking about this particular stone. You won't see any incision marks on this in the projection. I show you an enlarged detail of this, and you may just faintly see also the lines and maybe also a zigzag motif. It's easiest to be seen in the linear representation, which I've taken from the book of Antonia Thomas, and also in its entirety. In this arrangement of sketchy lines, the zigzag motif shines through, asserting itself against all the other lines that here and there consolidate into opposed triangles. Other stones have edge-to-edge markings as well. Some of them are extensively covered with faint, overlapping lines, as if they had been repeatedly scratched without due attention to a coherent design. In one experiment, I did exactly that. I scratched a stone, applying many overlapping straight lines set at various angles to each other. And this is what it looked like. Many faint lines and one deliberately carved sign, well known to all Ness lovers, popularly called the butterfly motif, more scholarly termed opposed triangles. And here is a detail of the same stone. And now I move to a contemporary work by a Düsseldorf artist. The Düsseldorf-based artist Harald Nägeli did it, albeit on paper, and in a somewhat more deliberate way. Here we see a profusion of lines of different lengths placed next to and over each other at various angles. As we let our eyes wander around this image, and I invite you to do this, individual lines coincide and merge to new but temporary linear formations. We see V's, crosses, triangles, lozenges. Now, I'm showing you a little film. I hope it starts. Yeah, hang on. I'll go back. Okay. I used a digital microscope to wander around the scratched lines on the stone I just showed you. Zooming into these randomly created traces gave me a more detailed view. So I let this run to the end. Okay, and show you some film stills I've extracted from this little video. Now we can see forms such as crosses, triangles, lozenges. Compared to the Brodgar stone with its discrete ornaments. This was the trigger stone, as I take it, for Antonia Thomas' research. Many of the incised stones found at the Ness appear either very sketchy or downright randomly marked. By no stretch of the imagination can these marks then be considered intentional art. To me, they are rather more like a byproduct of another activity that left these visible traces. And again, an example from a different time and a different place. These are groove marks in a church portal, somewhere in Austria or southern Germany, or I don't know exactly where. I'm thinking here of the grooves and cup marks that, for example, can be found on stones in church walls or the stony surrounds of wells. The explanations for these marks all have to do with human activities. At the wells, it is most likely that the grooves are associated with the sharpening of knives or scythes. For the grooves in church walls, particularly near the portal, it is claimed that men carrying sidearms would have drawn their weapons through one of the grooves before entering the church. By doing so, they were waiving their ability to put up a fight whilst inside the church. Cup marks found in church buildings are attributed to the belief in the curative effects of the scraped out powder. Now, if these customs and beliefs lasted right into modern history, why should this have been so different for Neolithic people, particularly knowing that to them stone was not just an expedient material. Handling the stones when building could have involved making marks, ones that are strikingly similar to those found in the landscape around them and where the stones for building came from. This could explain the marks that were not made to be seen, but just to be there. I know Mark proffered a different explanation in his talk last week, but I'm not alone when noticing this remarkable similarity between what we see in the landscape, for example, here on a weathered area of a cliff, or water-worn as here, or eroded as here. And it's easy to come to the conclusion that something of that got imparted in the stone before the erection of the buildings and during their use. Now, coming back to structure 1. In structure 1, there is one stone that, to me, stands out. This stone in the bottom range of the outer wall emphasizes the eastern corner of the southern entrance. 5 cup marks, neatly carved like the 5 on a dice, are set on the squarish face of a cubicular stone. This was made to be seen, and it was placed there deliberately. So I believe. To me, one who is familiar with the signs and symbols in Neolithic passage graves across Europe, it is not too far-fetched to ascribe to it a symbolic character, since it also reminds me of Marianne's understanding that the emblems found on the first orthostat in many passage graves tend to indicate the theme that is decisive for the monument as a whole. Here, in structure 1, it could have something to do with important activities inside. I do not know, and I don't want to elaborate on this, but I do want to show you an example of the signs found in a similar position in Ireland. It's Cairntee in Loch Crew, and it's right at the beginning of the passage then, and you must know that Cairntee is aligned to the equinox, so at this point in the year which divides the dark half of the year from the light half of the year, at the point of the ever increasing sun and lightness and the ever decreasing sun and lightness. And so you get here small circles, single cup marks, and expanding circles with many subdivisions, and makes sense that the stone is there where it stands. Now, going back to structure 1 and stone with a picked ornament in the southern wall when you are inside to the right of the entrance. In Orkney and at the Ness, there are some stones with picked ornaments, such as this one, that was centrally set in the interior wall of structure 1, which is largely composed of ranges of flagstones. Its position clearly shows that this stone must have been considered special. So, other stones with similar picked ornaments were incorporated, for example, at the bottom of the blocked entrance of structure 12, and its sparse decoration bears resemblance to that of a stone found when excavating the settlement of Smurcoy. The picking on all three of them is quite coarse. Stones with picked ornaments don't occur often in the buildings of Neolithic Orkney, though most recently 2 more examples have been found at the Ness. One in structure 26, which is next to structure 10, and one in Trench J in structure 5 there. Both the motif titled Horned Spiral. On the whole, it is assumed that these stones, with their crude signs, stem from older structures and have been introduced in the new building in prominent or otherwise significant positions. By and large, though, the structures in Orkney are pure architecture. Earlier on in my talk, I made reference to Meshow, and this for good reasons. Meshow is pure architecture, and it is the pureness of its quadrate space, its squareness emphasized by the corner pillars, that creates the impact. A remarkable feature in Meshow are the picturesque stones in the corbelled roof. The edges of the stones were smoothed and thus aid and underline the architectural character. By contrast, the incision marks that were also noted there are hardly evident. They can only be seen on very close inspection. In my drawings, then, I strive to capture this masterpiece of symmetry and the effect it had on me. Meshow, This mound with its crystal core is abstracted geometry, and in this, quite different to the monuments in Ireland or Brittany, with their richly ornamented surfaces, with a lively profusion of concentric circles, spirals, radiating arcs, cup marks, star busts, and so on. And just a few other examples. This is the end stone of the end niche in Cairntee in Loughcrew, Ireland. And I talked a little bit about that before, and here it's like you are entering, I don't know, entering summer and the flowers, and you are just really happy when you see it. Or the motif at Newgrange, the triple spiral, which became its kind of trademark there, a very well executed, quite small emblem on quite a large stone, and detail of the curved stone Mike already showed in his talk last year. It's in Newgrange, opposite the entrance stone on the other side of the mound. So, in contrast to what I just showed you, Meshow, in its geometric abstraction, radiates austerity. According to the timeline in Antonia Thomas' book, structures 1 and 12 predate Meshow by approximately 300 years. It is not up to me to tell all the ups and downs in the history of these buildings and the changes they had undergone. This is a long and complicated story that archaeologists are still striving to unravel, as well as trying to understand the chronology of this architectural complex more fully, seeing the structures individually as well as in relation to each other. As an artist, I can bring a different view and perspective to these monuments, the stones, their artifacts, and what has been recovered from them. Now, the stones I'm showing you now may be roughly contemporary to Meshow. Now, this is contention, is not based on exact dating. This contention is based on the observation that these sculpted stones display a similar degree of abstraction as Meshow. They were found inside structure 8, respectively in the robbing backfill of structure 10, and therefore their original context is not known. When I worked out my talk, I knew these stones only from photographs. I was fortunate that I could see them recently in person, so to speak, and to me there's no doubt that these stones are two very fine examples of picked ornaments in bas relief, and even more importantly, as an embodiment of abstraction of the figures 3 and 4, which in the form of these stones can be experienced in as tangible corporeality. The cup marks that were found on various stones in constellations of 3s, 4s and 5s are more abstract in that they mark the corner points of the triangle and the square. Now, I'm showing you the rectangular stone again and the cup marks on the stone in structure 1. Just as the sandstone block on the left from structure 12, the 5 cup marks on the cubical cornerstone in structure 1 represent also the 3, though more by implication. This is because the fifth cup mark in the center marks the crossing point of the diagonals, which divide the square into 4 equilateral triangles. But it is the corporeality of geometry that is of particular interest. To my mind, this is a notable development unique to the late Neolithic in Orkney. In addition to the examples already discussed, there are quite a number of cube-shaped and picturesque blocks of stone in prominent positions. For example, like this in the photograph in the pier of structure 12. Picking larger areas requires a constant and repetitious percussive action, working away. Having experimented with repetitious actions myself, I know from experience that it is possible to lose oneself in repetitious mark-making, be it in packing on stone or making marks on paper, when it is conducted with equanimity. Most likely, the sound created when hitting the stone would have additionally helped transport Neolithic man into a different state of consciousness that would have led him to a space of working away. Now, this is this stone I just showed you in detail. And now I would like to conclude my talk by thanking those in presence or in absence who made this talk possible. It's Nick Hart who planted the idea of this talk in the first hand. To the Orkney Archaeology Society for making this talk possible. To Hayley Green for her organizational support and her words at the beginning. And last but not least, in absence, to Marianne Pollich, who cannot be here today, for sharing her insights with me and for accompanying commentaries, when I was putting this talk together. And finally, together with thanking you all for your attention, a few words concerning the future. This, incidentally, is a piece on porcelain I made resulting from my work at the Ness. I was planning to stage an exhibition with the work that has come from my time at the Ness to be shown here in Orkney to enhance and to complement today's talk. Unfortunately, this did not work out. Since Ireland is calling, I think, next year, I cannot return in 2019. And so the exhibition, which now can also include work that is yet to come, will likely be staged in Düsseldorf or near Düsseldorf. Since I do want to make it available here as well, I'm quite certain that I will find a suitable way to transport the exhibition digitally to Orkney. So please watch out for it next year.